And welcome back, everyone. In today's video, I want to talk about the exciting match Dubov against Hans Niemann, which was happening over the last couple of days, in 2 days to be exact. And it was a blitz match organized basically privately. So Hans kind of challenged Dubov to this match after that controversy which happened in the World Blitz Championship, where Dubov didn't show up to their game. And then Hans basically challenged Dubov to this match, and they had some back and forth on Twitter X, and all of a sudden they did agree on the match with certain conditions that I think if Dubov wins, he will get 50,000 as a prize. To be fair, 100,000 as a prize, but 50% of that will go to charity and 50% to Dubov's personal bank account. And I'm sure you've seen the match, and Dubov won, so that in fact has come to reality. I'm not exactly sure how Hans finances that, or if he has a large sponsor behind that. I would be very curious to know all of that, because it is a lot of money after all. But the match was super exciting. All of the games were very well thought out, and I had a great time watching the match overall. So I want to go through 3 games which I thought to be the most exciting. So let's have a look at the first game I want to show you guys. That was in round 4, where Daniil Dubov lost with white pieces. And it was an English opening with c4, knight f6, knight c3, and e5, knight f3, and knight c6. One reason why black usually chooses this move order is to avoid the line e5 and now g3. When the knight is still on b1, there is no bishop b4 here, possibly attacking the threatening to trade on c3, which is the case after knight f6, knight c3, e5. If now white goes g3, black can go bishop b4 and can go to some sort of Rossolimo reverse. So this is kind of the whole idea why black players often start with the move knight f6. So we have this very classical 4 knights variation of the English, e3, and Hans goes for the sideline bishop e7, which is quite interesting, but by far the main move here is bishop b4, again with the idea to take on c3. Queen c2 is the main line, and now black has 2 options. One is to trade on c3 right away, the other one is to castle. Again, castling allows this move knight d5, which we saw something similar happen in the game. That's why black sometimes takes first and then goes queen e7 to not allow any knight d5 jumps, and then tries to push for a quick d5 here. But Hans goes for bishop e7, which is also quite a decent sideline here. Dubov goes a3, short castle, and now queen c2. Instead of a3, I remember this move queen b3, which looks quite odd, but the point is simply that white will completely avoid the push d5, and then will just play slowly bishop e2, short castle d3, and so on. Later on, the queen can also go back to c2. That is another option. But Dubov went a3 and queen c2, which also strikes me as quite interesting. Rook e8 was played by Hans. Again, d5 is probably more in the sense of the position here. Rook e8, now b4, bishop f8, and here Dubov played bishop d3, a very interesting setup which we don't see quite often here, the queen on c2 and the bishop on d3. Usually the setup is only with the pawn on d4. With the pawn on d2 it looks quite strange, but it's actually a very interesting idea. Hans played the move bishop takes b4 here, which is again, to come up with this in a blitz game strikes me as quite just a very interesting decision overall. And now Dubov goes for knight g5, which he played very fast, but in fact is already more or less the losing mistake. Instead, he should have gone for something like knight d5 or knight e4, and then he will win the pawn on h7, because now he has to move the bishop. By the way, to point out, a takes b4 also doesn't work well, because of the knight b4, the queen has to move, and then black can take and go e4 here, and then he will win back the piece. But he went knight g5. Again, as I said, knight d5 or knight e4 would be better, when now a takes b4 is already a threat, and now if the bishop goes back, white can take and then take on h7 when the king is probably quite weak. Bishop can go back to e4 here, for example. Looks a bit better for white. But Dubov went knight g5, as I said, and now bishop takes c3, bishop takes h7, king f8, and he went for d takes c3. And now we can already see that white's structure is more or less permanently damaged. When I watched this game live, I didn't realize the position is already so bad for white, but objectively it's already quite bad. Dubov went h4 with the idea of knight g5, queen h7, and well, here I thought, well, knight g5 and queen h7 is coming. I didn't really see how black can stop that, but Hans found a very strong move e4 here, which completely blocks off the queen and also stops white from possibly going e4 later on to activate the bishop on c1. And this bishop on c1, as we will later see, actually never really joined the game. Dubov has to bring back his knight g5, d6, f3, now f6, another very nice move, knight takes e4 and bishop f5. And this is just turning into an absolute strategical disaster for Dubov, and Hans managed to convert the game very nicely. So also if white trades here, the endgame is just horrific. Pawn on c4 will fall, also c3 is weak, and also here the bishop on c1 is not coming out anytime soon. So Dubov played queen d2, queen takes c4, rook b1, Hans just b6, protecting the pawn on b7, hg7, king g7, and even though the king is quite lonely here, there are not enough threats for white to generate. If queen f2 that happened in the game, just king h8, rook h8, and queen g3 doesn't do much because black can just go step to the side with king f7, so rook f1, rook h6, queen g3, rook g6, and here, around here, Dubov already resigned. I think it was here after king e7 because, well, there are all sorts of threats. Rook g1 is coming, knight d3 is there, and yeah, white's position is just lost. Also, if he trades, it doesn't do. There's not much of a difference here. The king is very safe on e7, and also black is how many pawns? 2 pawns up, so it's just completely lost. So this game was one of the games which Hans played very well and won a very nice and deserved game. So let's have a look at the next game. All right, so the next game we're gonna check out was from round 7, where Hans had the white pieces and Dubov had black. And Hans, as always in that match, went for e4, and we quite often saw the Italian as we did in this game. And Dubov in general had quite an interesting setup in mind and has played that quite often. He played d3, bishop e7, which has become quite popular lately. At first, it looks like more of a passive version than compared to the main line with bishop c5. But in fact, it's not entirely clear, and the bishop can often also do something on this diagonal, as we see later in the game. And the downside of bishop c5 as well is that often white can harass that bishop with later on c3 and b4. So therefore, many people have shifted to the move bishop e7. Hans played short castle, and now played the move rook e1. In that position, white in general has quite a lot of different tries. I think knight c3 is now the main move, and after d6, white has both moves a3 and a4, and yeah, nowadays there's quite some theory here. Rook e1, d6 was played, and Hans played a4. So in general, once black plays the move d6 and he's protecting the pawn on e5, he's sort of threatening knight a5. For example, if white goes something like h3 now, knight a5 would be sort of a positional threat when white wins the bishop pair, because if the bishop goes back, black can just take and yeah, won the 2 bishops and has no problems here whatsoever. If bishop b5, it's sort of the same story, a6, bishop e4 and b5, and bishop has to retreat, and black again wins the bishop pair and has a comfortable position. So therefore Hans played a4 to now have the move knight a4, knight a5, bishop a2. Also black players play like this with the idea of c5. That's something they play quite often, when then the knight often retreats to the c6 square. That's another idea. But Dubov went for bishop e6. Now Hans plays knight d2. He didn't want to take on e6, when after f takes e6 we will reach sort of a similar structure than we did later in the game. But in general, black is playing for the king side here in general. So there's often ideas like queen e8 and queen h5 there, and often also knight h5, knight f4, but we will see something similar to that later in the game. So Hans played knight d2 first, and here Dubov played a5, not wanting to take on c4 just yet, when I guess Hans would have captured with the knight, and perhaps this move f takes e6 would even be in black's favor, because now the knight could possibly go to f5 or even sometimes to d5 as well. Dubov played a5, just fixing white's pawn structure on the queen side, not allowing him to advance his pawns later on in the stage. Hans played b3, which is also quite a novel idea in the Italian, which we see sometimes. White often gets ready to recapture with the pawn on c4. So now I could see one idea for white to immediately go knight f1 next, and after bishop takes c4 he can always recapture with the b pawn, capturing towards the center. So this could be one of his ideas here. Dubov played h6 with a very interesting plan, which is knight h7, which is another Very nice idea in the Italian and also in the Spanish. Sometimes we see black is trying to exchange this knight with knight g5, and also in some cases he will have the opportunity to open the f-file with f5, and also once white takes on e6, then the rook has already control of the f-file as it happened in the game. But Hans played the move c3. Now we see knight g5 and rook a2, another common motive in the Italian. When white plays with this move b3 to activate the rook along the second rank. Queen d7, bishop takes e6, and f takes e6. And now we have reached finally this position, and objectively the position is around equal, but I think that black has sort of an easy plan here. White's play on the queen side, where he usually plays in this position, has sort of slowed down due to black's nice move a5, and now he has a quite simple plan to just double his rooks along the f-file. Hans played knight h2, maybe sort of passive already, maybe should have captured here, but after bishop takes g5, I'm quite sure that black also doesn't have any problems here whatsoever. Maybe knight f1, bishop c1, queen c1. Also here black could continue something like rook f7 or rook f6. Looks quite solid for black as well. But Hans played knight h2, now rook f7, adheres to the plan as mentioned earlier, just doubling the rooks, and now Hans captures on g5, which maybe is an inaccuracy already, but it makes sense to get rid of this active knight on g5 here as well from a practical point of view. So he took here and went g3, preparing to go h4 next. But here Dubov correctly assessed that now it's time to play in the center as well with d5. The move d5 is always something you have to be quite careful here with these doubled pawns, because it does weaken the e5 pawn significantly. So that's always something you need to outweigh, whether it's the right decision to go for the move d5. But here Dubov assessed it correctly that it's a very strong move. h4, pushing back the bishop, bishop e7, and now Hans played knight g4, which seems like is too slow, but already this position looks quite hard to play. Computer says that e takes d5 is better, but it's hard to understand what white is trying to go for after e takes d5. Practically speaking, it looks like black is doing very well here as well. Maybe white has to stop this by going d4, but then all of a sudden the pawn on d4 also becomes a major weakness as well. So Hans went knight g4, and now bishop to c5 was played. King g2 and king h7. I don't fully understand why Dubov didn't go h5 immediately, pushing back the knight, but he did go king h7, knight h2, and queen d6, protecting the pawn on e5. Queen b1 with possibly the idea to have some d4 things happening. Let's just say black makes a move like b6, then d4 would perhaps win the game, because if e takes d4, there's this discovered check with e5. Quite a nasty idea from white. But Dubov played the strong move d4, and now white's issue is that if he plays the move c4, then the knight will get trapped on g4 if black goes h5. And Hans took, but after bishop d4, now these doubled pawns again are quite strong here, because all these squares are protected, the rooks have the open f-file, and on top of that, black's pieces have the very nice d4 square. Queen d1, knight b4, rook e2, queen a6, very strong move by Dubov as well, targeting the pawn on d3. Rook d2, bishop c3. So here it's already over, otherwise the pawn on d3 is just dropping, but doesn't really change here what white is doing. White is just strategically busted here. He played rook d2, gave the exchange, and here there was another nice moment in the end where Dubov finished it off nicely here after queen c2. Of course, he could also exchange queens, and it should be quite easily winning, but he went for the move knight f4, which is quite beautiful. And after g takes f4, queen takes f3, Hans resigned, because if the king moves, black can simply take here and take everything. Take on f4, take on d2, then take on g4. So this is just game over. Very nicely played game by Dubov. Also, the opening plan was something I very much enjoyed to see, fixing the queen side with a5 and then fully shifting towards the play on the king side. So really enjoyed that game, and a very deserved win for Dubov. So let's jump to the next game. All right, so the next and final game we're going to have a look at was also the final game of the match. This was game 18 of the famous Dubov against Hans Niemann match. And Dubov had the white pieces in the last game, and as he usually does, he played the Catalan, which is kind of his pet line. Hans went for bishop e7, bishop g2, short castle, and after d takes e4, he went for the move queen a4 here, which is not the main line. Mostly white plays queen c2 here, with the point that after a6 now, white can go a4 and then recapture on c4 without allowing black to play b5, which did happen in the game. So Dubov played queen a4, a6, and now queen takes c4. One has to say that if you go for this line with queen takes c4, then queen a4 is probably a more accurate way to start, because if queen c2, black does have the extra option to go for this line with b5 as well. Maybe that's why Dubov played queen a4 as well. a6, queen c4, b5, queen c2, bishop b7. So this is one of the very old and classical lines of this opening. Dubov played bishop d2, bishop b4, queen c1, and now c6. So this is sort of mainstream theory here. Instead of bishop d2, white has tried many moves as well, like bishop f4 is a move I think I even played myself some time ago. So Magnus has a game here. White is very solid, but so is black, so there's usually not that much happening here. Bishop d2, bishop b4, so black wants to put out his bishop of this pawn chain and then only play c6 and then prepare knight d7, rook c8 often, and then c5 sooner or later. Dubov goes e3, knight d7, knight c3. And now Hans took on f3, which is not a bad move itself, but he could have also done something like bishop d3 or bishop g6 would have also been possible for him as well. But he took and played rook c8. I actually like that approach, just to give up that bishop, because also it's not so clear what this bishop in fact is doing here along this long diagonal when black is pushing c5 next. Dubov played knight e2, now c5, queen e1, and queen b6. So Hans played very logical moves here, and I sort of liked his position, even though objectively it's around balanced. D takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop g2, knight e5. Quite logical here, bishop c3 and now b4. So maybe bishop c3 he didn't have to go back. Knight f4 would be another possibility here, but it does allow black even to push g5. Could be an option just to push out the knight. I'm just trying to think how white might avoid the move knight d3, which does look at least practically a bit unpleasant, or knight c4 could also be an idea for black. So it's out of the question for me that black has a sort of comfortable position here. Even the computer even gives a slight edge to white here. Dubov went back, bishop c3, and now b4, bishop d4, a5, queen d1, rook d8, so not much is happening here. Queen b3, bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, just a balanced position overall. Knight d7, rook c1 was played, queen b6, queen d1, knight f6, and around here, Dubov played queen e2, and here was a moment where I was a little bit shocked that Dubov played the move f4, but in fact it is a very good move. It's just a move which you have to be quite sure about, because it does weaken white's king sort of long term. But Dubov assessed correctly that he will gain entry of the c6 square, which is much more important than the long-term weakness of the pawn on e3 and also arguably of the pawn on g3. So Hans now took on c1 and went knight d7. Important to say that knight d7 immediately doesn't work as well, because now white has knight c6 and the rook has to move, and then there's knight d7 check. So that's why he has to take first. Here white is just winning the exchange and the game. So Hans took and went knight d7, rook c6, and now white's pieces are getting very active here. Rook c4, Dubov played this stage of the game very well. Pawn on b4 now is also quite a big weakness, and knight c6 is a major threat. Queen d6 was Hans's move, knight c6, rook e8, rook d4, queen f8, rook takes b4, and e5. A good practical decision, even though it's objectively not the best move, but Hans is trying to get some counterplay here, and practically speaking, this is not entirely easy for white, even though the computer gives already a winning advantage here. But all of these pawns are sort of loose here, and there are even some ideas with knight h5 perhaps. And white has to be quite careful here to defend against all of these threats which black has. Dubov immediately went wrong, queen c4. Instead, rook takes a4 would have worked according to the computer, but not an easy decision to make after ef4, for example, rook f4. It does still look like black has some sort of compensation here, like a move like queen c5, but of course the computer doesn't care about these moves like b4, king h2 are supposed to be winning for white. But Dubov went queen c4, queen d6, king h2, h5, also a move I quite liked, even though the computer doesn't, but white has to be now careful of ideas connected with h4. And Dubov went rook b7, and here I was a bit surprised that Hans didn't go for the move h4, but instead took, and after queen takes f4 went queen c5. H4 immediately just would have looked so natural, just opening up this diagonal for black's king. But instead, now queen c5 was played, and Dubov went for queen d4, exchanging the queens. Very logical. Again, objectively speaking, knight b8 would have been an insane winning move in this position. I'm not even sure anyone would see this in a classical game. Point is, again, to exchange many pieces, because in an endgame, white will be winning because he's a pawn up. And here it seems like black cannot really escape the trades. If knight takes b8, there's queen takes f6, and pawn on f7 will fall. But knight b8 is a very, very tough move to find. Queen d4 was Dubov's move, quite logical. Again, he wants to exchange queens because in the end he will have this passed pawn. Rook takes e3, takes, and rook e7. Hans went for the endgame, and now objectively it's around equal. Knight d3, b3, a3. So here it looked like Hans is maybe trying to push for a win at some moment, at least here. For example, here the move knight b1, he was trying to hold on to the pawn on a3. Instead, knight takes a2 would have probably ended in a draw. Knight b4. I would still pick white here because he does have the outside passer, but yeah, objectively this should end in a draw. So Hans went for knight b1, b4, knight d2 back. I guess he realized that now the downside of knight b1 was that he allows b4 and went back. And now knight takes a3 was a little bit shocking for me. When I watched this live, bishop d5 seemed like quite a logical move as well, because the bishop is completely restricting this knight and is at the same time protecting the pawn on a2. I'm not sure what he didn't like, maybe that the king will attack the bishop with the tempo. Also, I'm not blaming him at all. He was on 5 seconds, so things like this can happen for sure. Knight c4, and on top of that, he got like a risk-free position here. So it's, again, no blames at all for Dubov. He played this game very, very well, as he did all of the other games as well. So this endgame, yeah, computer screams that this is 0.00, but in a blitz game, I think that many players would lose this as black, just because white has the outside passer and the king always has to worry and often has to run over to the queen side. And in that time, white will try to pick up all these pawns on the king side. Dubov plays b6, knight b4, b7, knight c6, h4, fixing the queen side, the king side pawns. Didn't fully understand that. I thought king g2 is more logical to immediately run over, but I guess h4 also does have a point. King e6 was Hans's move, king g2, king d5, knight a5, an important idea because black can never take because white is queening. So he has to go back with a knight, and now king f3, king c5, king e4, f6, knight b3. Both players are playing perfectly here, and just around here we are reaching the climax of the game. Hans played g5 when it looked like it's heading towards a draw, because, for example, if white takes and tries to approach with the king, black will just manage to trade the remaining pawns. Another move which I thought could be dangerous is the move king e6, going for an endgame like this, but it does seem like black is in time with the king. He can run over to these squares here and shouldn't lose the game. So Dubov unleashed the very interesting try g4 here, which, at least from a practical point of view, makes black's task much harder, and Hans went for h takes g4, which is already the losing move. It looks like black has still a way to draw. G takes h4 would have been one of them, and if gh5, h3, knight f3. Now he has to bring the knight, and here he has both knight e5 and knight d8 just in time to bring back the knight, and still it's not entirely obvious at all here. After king e6, black has to find the move h2 here, and if knight h2, knight g5, then he's picking up the last pawn. So very hard to find all of this with seconds on the clock, but really have to give props to Dubov. G4 is such an amazing move to find in a blitz game with like 5 seconds on the clock. That was a very nice find by him. Hans took on g4, and after h5 now it's lost, because there's no way for him to reach this pawn, and here he lost on time. He did want to make the move g3, but white could even take here and then just push the pawn. The knight is not in time to pick that pawn up. If knight h2, it's important not to push h6 because then it would be a draw, but instead to play a move like king f5, for example, or king g5, and then just to push this pawn, and white is winning. So that was the match. Overall, it was very exciting to watch. Also, I have to give props to Hans for organizing these matches. Like, you you can say whatever you want about him, but that he's organizing all of these matches basically by himself and coming up with this money also by himself is quite a cool thing. You just have to say it like it is. And yeah, I'm just very curious what will happen now between those two guys, because they did say that the loser of the match has to answer one question under a polygraph test, so sort of a lie detector test. And now it's already 2 days after the match and still nothing has been said yet. So if you guys know anything, if they will in fact have this lie detector test or not, that will be interesting to know. Also what Dubov might ask Hans. But yeah, for now it does look like nothing is happening. But if you guys know something, definitely let me know in the comment section down below. And if you did like this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And otherwise, I will see you soon. Thank you guys for watching.